we are now going to have an open discussion, just to try and sum up some of the things that I think have come out of today. Although there's so much to sort of recount, but we've talked a lot about childhood reading and how the care experienced community um, can be validated and heard as a result of literature and reading, how we've talked about care experiences across generations, which I think has been very interesting and helpful. We've talked about sharing memories and cultures. We've heard about care experienced people being overrepresented in prison in the mental ill health um, stages of life and in homelessness. We've talked about shifting narratives and how care experience and culture can be archived to celebrate the creative and the ingenious ways in which we are making a contribution to literature, art, culture, education, academia, and much more, really. Um, we've talked about stereotypical challenges and portrayals of young people in foster care and how our individual childhoods have sort of shaped our creative processes and adventures. Um, I hope that my students, for example, who are some of whom are here, will think about the lack of voice that um, children have in these kind of care experienced environments, um, and how their voices can be heard, perhaps through creativity and through literature. Um, and I think it was Bernadette who talked about um, not being aware or open to the fact that her writing was very much about her care experienced history, but she didn't realize that until the very end of her PhD. And I think that's quite something, um, and sort of says an awful lot. However, we kind of bring it all together. We've looked at things from very different perspectives, but collective um, collective commonalities, I think, and lots of things to share, and lots of things that probably resonate with all of us. Um, so we're going to ask the panel members to come back. Um, if you can show yourselves again, that would be really helpful. But turn your mics off for the moment. What we'd like you to do is, if you want to ask a question, perhaps you can raise your hand in the chat. You don't have to put the question there unless you don't want to speak. Then do put the question there. But if you just want to ask a question, then just put a yellow hand. I think they're usually yellow, in the chat, and I'll try and direct you accordingly. So does anybody want to start off? Anyone got a question to start with?
I'm a SEN casework officer, so I'm care experience, and I also have complex SEN. And now people talk about things, I'll start backtracking because I've started to be more open and say, well, actually, I'll frame it as speaking as a professional. However, with my lived experience as a care experienced individual, and yeah, it's something that I struggle with. I particularly have some very challenging adoptive parents, and I know my colleague is really rude that one day I'm going to say what I really think to some of them who I come across as very virtuous. Aren't we wonderful? And I'm there as the professional. I'm not there to say, well, actually, I
Yeah.
really think your tone is quite frankly very frustrating because you're doing it in such a way that just reading it is, say, you are virtuous. Everything's about, we need all this support because we adopted them and or it's hard to explain without obviously going into disclosing personal details of the children, but it's really very frustrating.
Yeah.
So if anyone, definitely has any when how you manage it other than worrying about that I'm going to lose my mask, I'd be delighted to also hear.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer. JP, you had a question?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, it's really early in the morning here. Good to see everybody. I've had a wonderful time. So Tara, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it's really difficult to navigate those conversations, particularly with people in power. I was sitting in, when I was a doc student, I was sitting in a training with like a judge in Boston where I did my PhD. And he said something which, because I disclosed being in care, and he said something which I know in his brain he thought was like a very nice thing to say to me, which was like, oh my God, look at you, you beat all of the odds, and here you are, like sitting in a doc program. And I see Jennifer like putting her head in her hand, right? Because I had to like sit there and just like say to this very much older, very powerful man, I said, "Hey, look, like I totally appreciate the fact that what you were trying to say is like look at how much you've accomplished, but what I heard was you're such a weird outcome to be here, right? Like you've kind of pointed out this difference that I have, and you don't know anything about the lived experience of anybody else at this table because they haven't told you anything. All you know is that, kids don't, from foster care, don't get PhDs. And so now I'm the weird one at the table. And he would not hear it. He just legitimately was like, no, like, you're wrong. And I'm like, I don't really think how I feel is wrong, but like, do you, bro? Um, my colleagues will tell you that I tend to be fairly candid and I really don't care. I'm like, if I'm not owing to you, then I'm not really here to mince words or preserve your feelings. Um, but I think that like those light touches of like, hey, I know that you meant well, but what I heard was, and how that made me feel is this way, sometimes helps in those professional contexts. But yeah, it's a difficult balancing act.
Thank you. Tony?
Hi there. Yeah, I was in care in the 70s, a long time ago. Can you hear me okay? Because I had some bad technology issues. And anyway, I went to UC Berkeley for my PhD, and I wasn't even allowed to talk about my identity. And I've shared this with JP and others who are here today. It's great to see you all. And so it wasn't even allowed. And then, I watched TV sometimes, and on any crime show, all the villains are former foster youth. That gets to me. It's really crazy. And so I am very annoyed by the fact that we can't have our own identity, and we're starting to build one. And so I'm really happy about that. That's all I have to say. I'm just touched by what I heard and wish I could have gotten on earlier. And I hope this will be recorded and sent out to us in full form.
Yes, it will. It will be sent out to you. Thank you,
Okay.
Tony.
Thank you.
Josie?
I was just going to try and circle back to the ethics question. Where has she gone? Yes, there you are. I have no, I can't answer definitively, but there is a huge part of me thinking by any means necessary, get the truth from them. But I would imagine you can only run it by your ethics supervisors, I guess, if you really want the answer to whether it's an ethical dilemma. Sorry, not much of an answer, but that's what I would, I think it's great to bring the question up. Thanks.
Anyone else? Any questions?
I can also add to the ethics question if that helps.
Yes, please.
It entirely depends on your university's ethics board. but mine required me to explain in intrinsic detail how I was protecting everybody else as well as myself in my story. So that involved sort of my own redaction process, my own. I also had to agree to weekly counselling to make sure I wasn't delving too far down the rabbit hole kind of stuff. But it's so you research your ethics committee, see what it is that they need from you, and then work around or find a unique way of working around those particular issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Anyone else with any questions?
Can I just make a comment on the ethics? And it was interesting what Dave just had to say, because I've just had supervision last week where we were discussing part of my ethics proposal is how I will, at what point would I share with my participants that I'm care experienced as well, because it's looking at how it can then influence them to maybe feel like they therefore share more than they would with somebody who's not care experienced. I think it's looking at it from, it's quite interesting what they had to say as well. So it's almost the opposite way round. We're thinking about the participants who themselves, will be care experienced that round me. At what point do I disclose it? Do I disclose it as part of my care experience researcher who's seeking to do, and this is why I'm doing this research? Or do you bring it in sort of later when they've agreed to sort of have a meeting with you? Because you don't want to put anyone in a position where maybe they are sharing more than they would want to.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Just while people might be thinking about other questions, there was a hope that there might be a sort of network or a forum that comes out of this symposium of sort of like-minded people. I'm wondering how that feels for people. Does that sound like something you might be interested in getting involved in? Great, that's really good news. So we will send you information about that in due course, but that's really good to know that people are interested in that. Any other questions? Jennifer, your hand's up. Is that you again? Or oh, that was a thumbs up. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay. Let me just have a look in the chat. Yeah, everyone's looks like they're really up for that. And Josie. Great. Is that an article, Josie, you've put there?
Yeah, I was responding to Tony, who had strong feelings about seeing the murderers being care experienced. There's a piece on the Care Experience and Culture website that I wrote about. What about the other 84%? There was some research done that said 16% of serial killers, actual research this was, way back before we all got so hyper connected, by the FBI, I think they said 16% of serial killers were adopted, which was a big figure. But my question is, what about the 84% of serial killers who aren't adopted? They all come from straight up families, which are supposed to be the ideal. So I wrote a little bit about it on the Care Experience and Culture website, which is a really good resource, Tony.
Right. Somebody's asked in the chat, RC, I'm not sure who RC is, but thank you for your question. What steps? Oh, it's you. Sorry, I didn't realize it was you. So you said what steps should be put in place when researching as a care experienced person.
Yeah.
Anyone got any ideas about that?
Any of the speakers from earlier?
You need to keep yourself safe is the first one, would be my first piece of advice. Whatever coping mechanisms, whatever comfort blankets, whatever sort of ways to keep yourself safe, that should be your priority when researching as a care experience person.
Katrina.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I've just started on my postgraduate journey with the University of Huddersfield, so I've been listening with great intent today. My topic is transracial adoption and fostering and the identity, and I am using autoethnography, so it's super important. I have two incredible supervisors who have already kind of set me on the path of making sure I check in with my health and well-being. I've got a great GP, I've got great friends who I can kind of speak to, which is contrasting to when I did my master's, which I found that's only when I revealed I was care experienced, going back on what people have said. My master's is in career guidance, and I had to listen to a room of my peers talking in a negative way about care leavers. And that propelled me to reveal to my classmates that I was care experienced. And I think there's two folds to revealing when you are care experienced. I think I didn't speak about my care experiences for the longest time, but I think it can have a detrimental as it can have a positive, if that makes sense to you. But I think for me, having the support network in place, my supervisors know that I've got CPTSD. They are aware of, you know, my personal journey, if that makes sense. So the contingencies have already been put in place, and I'm kind of self-motivated through my own planning of going out and doing stuff and going for walks. I live behind a very famous world chocolate factory, so I am very, very lucky to live where I live. So I think for me, I've got really good supervisors, and I'm really looking forward to my journey. I think revealing that, you know, my subjective area is the fact that I am actually a product of being care experienced, and how I've cultivated my identity through being transracially fostered and adopted. So I will let my participants know that I am from that background, not just to, how can I sway an opinion, but to give a sense of identity and relationships and transparency. I've got a face where people tell me everything anyway. It's a true story. So I think for me, I used to be very ashamed of my career experience, but I think I'm becoming more proud now. I am up at this level, being recognised and given this section. You know, I'm hoping I'm going to do it justice and give it a really, really good voice. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Tracy. Tracy, we can't hear you.
So sorry. Thank you, Katrina. That was really helpful. There's two books, I think, here that have been recommended in the chat, if anybody's interested in those. Bernadette, your hand's up.
Thank you to Josie for telling me how to do it. I was trying to look for ages how to put my hand up and it was in the reactions. Yeah, I just wanted to continue for that comment before about disclosure. I had something quite interesting this year. So I finished my PhD last year and graduated in December. Still haven't really processed it. It feels like it was all like a dream. But I applied for some jobs, my first post-PhD jobs. And I got shortlisted for a position at the University of Warwick, and they said we need like some references straight away before the interview if possible. So my one of my supervisors, who usually does absolutely amazing references for me, speaks very highly of me, he texted me and said, is it okay to talk about your care experience and sort of, you know, mention, you know, how you've overcome things and stuff? And I was kind of like a bit that's quite interesting that he's kind of treating me a little bit differently, maybe than some of his past PhD students. He's trying to, like, I don't know, it seems like he's trying to follow this narrative of like, oh, she who has overcome. And I was a bit like, well, on one hand, it could look, they might, you know, be like, oh, wow, she's, you know, had this background and she's done a PhD, and you might see it in a positive light, but then also they could have some kind of unconscious bias or some, you know, preconceptions around people who are care experienced. You also don't know who these people are. So I was like, is that what you usually do? Because he'd already provided me several references for other jobs I've been shortlisted for. And he was like, you have been doing that. So he did go ahead and do it. And then I didn't get the job, which, you know, is fine. I was happy to be shortlisted in the current climate. But it did make me think, you know, what kind of things were they thinking when they read that reference about my background, and how that had impacted the things I said in reply to their questions during the sort of the panel and stuff. So it's quite an interesting one. Another comment as well. I think for people who do academic research and do a PhD, I know certainly for me, it becomes an opportunity to kind of build an identity you might not have had before. If you had been care experience, you've not really had a good sense of belonging. If you're doing a PhD, you're part of a PhD community. It's something that you're working towards. So when people finish their PhD and go into kind of the fresh world, a lot of people who haven't got care experience say they feel a bit kind of like, you know, burnt out or lacking identity because they're not a PhD student anymore. So I think maybe that's more compounded for people who've got care experience. I know myself, and I know Rosie Cannon's recently finished her PhD. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else had noticed anything like that with their experiences of research as a care experience researcher.
I'll just add, Bernadette, that that sounds a bit odd, what you've just described. I don't think they should have asked you that actually at all. But I think what I was going to just mention is the silence. You know, often it's that silence, isn't it, that after you've said, oh, you know, well, actually, I grew up in care. Sometimes there's a bit of a silence. And I can remember one of the first conferences that I went to. I was absolutely petrified anyway of speaking. And I just felt that there was this big silence. It might have been my own stuff, but it really did feel like, oh, you know, she's a bit odd, isn't she? Actually, I'm quite happy to be odd now. Very happy.
No, I know what you mean, because it's quite intimidating anyway, isn't it, being like a researcher as a mature student, which I am, and I know you identify that as well, and a bit over 21, and often parents are coming into academia later on because they've not had that opportunity, or they've had other life things in the way. It's taken that long to sort of realise they could be part of that kind of community. The thing I've had quite a lot is people have said like, oh, you don't look like your care experience. I'm like, what do care experience people look like? You know, kind of thing. They have this like certain image, but they don't mean it in a bad way. But I've had that answer quite a few times, and just think,
Yeah.
who are they? Like, you know, who are they? You know, kind of thing. Is that offering again, isn't it? But it's quite interesting, and people think like that's a compliment. I can't remember who it was. Somebody else said something about they've been given a compliment by the I think it was JP, by the person on the doc program, and it's meant to be a compliment, but it's not a compliment. You'd be basically saying you've got this preconceived idea that people who are care experienced look at, you know, a certain way, kind of thing. And so yeah, so it's quite interesting. I agree.
I think that's quite shocking, actually. Somebody said, should we all wear bells? Yeah. Tony.
Yeah. Well, I just want to reiterate, because as I said, I mean, I was in care and older now, and you know what? I don't care what they say. I'm a care leaver. I'm a person who left foster care. I went through the court system. I saw all of what it went when places were shut down because they weren't able to take care of the kids in their home. So I'm a little irritated. So I don't care anymore what people say. And there's methodologies to get around that if we're talking about research, as JP brought up in the chat. So I'm just saying, we wear our bells and be proud of those bells, because we have a lot to give. Whether you're in academia or an artist or a family member or a community member, we have a lot to give based on what we know. And we have to check and balance, folks who don't know. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tony. Rebecca?
Okay, so disclaimer, I don't have a concrete answer to either question. This is just a stream of consciousness and notes that I'm reading out based on a few areas that have come up. But one of them is, yeah, I'm not an academic, so I'm probably in the minority here, but I've worked as a social worker and also in kind of policy campaign roles. And one of the questions that came up was, what do we need as researchers? So I can respond to that. What do we need as care experience people working in any different kind of context where our care experience comes up? I think one of them really is some ground rules from the organisation that we're working for. So like many people here, probably, I've really experienced feeling like a token in an organisation, the token care experience person who will be wheeled out during National Care Leavers Week, or who will be invited to a meeting, to be one part of a panel of 10 other people who aren't care experienced. And there's been a lot of kind of platitudes. So a few things that I think that organisations should do are, for example, have some kind of written agreement in advance of what they're going to commit to us. So for me, that's been things like after I had a really horrific experience of being a token on a panel where everybody, I raised something from a care experience perspective, I don't agree with this, and everybody else just ignored and shut down and steamrolled ahead. So I then went back to the organisation and said, I never want to be the only, token person on a panel again. There needs to be minimum 2 or 3 of us in those spaces. So that's one. Other things are things like having an understanding of how our content will be used by an organisation. So I've worked in an organisation where I might have written a blog or a journal article or something about care 2 or 3 years ago, and then just annually that blog will be shared. And no one's actually checked in to say, oh, Becca, by the way, are you still 2 or 3 years down the line? Do you still feel comfortable with what you shared then? I think we're all on evolving journeys. And there needs to be more regular check-in. Or, for example, I get really frustrated that I wrote an academic paper maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and again, I'm in a slightly different place in my life now. There's a couple of things that I would maybe have liked to take out or edited slightly as my understanding has changed of my time in care, but there seems to be an institutional block that, no, you've written this, it's written in your blood forever now, so you can't change it. So there needs to be some flexibility there. And then things like, wherever our stories are shared, we need influence over what the headlines say or what the stock images are accompanying that, and so on. Or, we need some kind of debrief space afterwards ourselves. So that was rambly note to point 1. And then point 2, I think someone mentioned about disclosing and the pros and cons of that. My instinct is to always check in. Again, I'm not a researcher, but just ask the person directly or the group directly, would you find it beneficial knowing something about, me personally as a researcher, or do you want to kind of keep that completely separate? Because as a social worker, I was under really, really strict orders, never disclose, and, strict boundaries, which absolutely exist for some purpose and can make some people safe. But, like 1% of the time, actually, it could be groundbreaking, and the only meaningful intervention could be to sit down with a child and say, look, I've been there, I get it, I get that you don't want to stay in this foster placement tonight. And actually that brought down walls. So I've seen sometimes it can be life-changing, but also, I've been in as a kind of client in a therapeutic space, I have really valued not knowing anything about the professional, because that made me feel safe. So that's a very long-winded way of saying I think we should be asking participants what they feel comfortable with. And then the final point to say is I agree with what's been said in terms of people only feeling comfortable to share later on in life. I think so. In the UK, for anyone who doesn't know, in 2017, a new act came into was passed. A bill was passed. So now there's provisions in law to where care experienced people can receive support up to the age of 25. And I've really seen a shift, because I left care before, quite a few years before that. I definitely didn't disclose being care experienced until my late 20s and felt uncomfortable with that. But now that the support goes up to 25, it's really encouraging to see the new generation actually identify more as being care experienced, because they've got spaces and some resources to do that. I don't know what the conclusion from that was supposed to be. I can't really read my handwriting. But finally, to what Bernadette said about identity, yeah, I thought that was really important. I think there's a risk sometimes that the pendulum swings. I don't know anyone else, but I'm really quite a black or white thinker. So I went from never speaking about being in care ever to then maybe oversharing or over identifying with that part of who I was, to the exclusion of all else. So I'll leave it there. I hope there's some of that made sense.
Thank you, Rebecca. Annie?
Well, I just what would have helped is one of the questions as well. And the first thing I would say is, like, I've forgotten who said it earlier about how you probably have a route into education later in life if you've been care experienced. And one of the problems about that is you don't come from a traditional academic route, so therefore you might not belong to an institution, and therefore getting funding, independent funding, is really quite difficult without an institution to belong to. And I think other people have probably had those problems. And the second thing I want to say about my research, which Jim touched on earlier, is the sources and finding sources and accessibility to them. Because you have to look really hard to find some of them, especially the time period that I'm looking in, because they aren't as available. That's just a very personal thing to my research, not necessarily for everybody else. But I think we don't have the same access if you come into education later. It's so competitive now. There's so much. There's such a lot of cuts here, there, and everywhere. And you're competing, and I think Sally said this as well. She said that because she has a particular genre, it's not really accepted in some places. And I think like what she was saying about publishing, that people wanted that the personal tragic story rather than how she's been creative in her life. Because it probably makes more money if you hear those sort of aspects. So and I just want to say again, thank you. I've really enjoyed what people said today. I've learned an awful lot from what the other presenters, and I've been really impressed with the quality of everybody's presentations. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. JP?
Yeah, so I think the other thing that, because I think a lot of people are also like, how do we as care experienced people interact in the research arena? And one of the things that and I do appreciate Rebecca bringing up the tokenism that happens, like as somebody who's really involved in like federal and state level policy here in the United States, I have been that token and not known that I was that token until much later in my life, where I'm like, oh wow, like that was a really bad experience. And one of the things that was really helpful was like participating in like a strategic sharing workshop that I was able to participate in, which was really about like, how do we avoid getting asked and answering the third date question. And it's third date, right? A third date question is like a far more kind of like a far more intrusive question than you might ask on the first date, right? So like if I'm on a panel and I've identified myself as a care experience person, people, for some strange reason, when I was doing panels, people would often feel like they had a right to kind of like my personal story. Like, what brought you into care? What was your care experience like? Were you ever abused? Were you ever molested? Like, all sorts of like really invasive questions where I'm like, yeah, like nobody's asking that to any of the other panelists, right? Like I'm the only one on the panel who's being asked this question. And I think back, and the only reason I share that is because I think back to that whenever I'm developing or designing any kind of research instrument, right? So, like, as a researcher, I don't want to compel someone to answer those third date questions without necessarily establishing all of that rapport, right? And so that really guides my sense of disclosure. So if I don't think I'm going to ask any kind of really deep question and there's no reason for me to disclose who I am, like my status and any of that, I may not. But if I think I'm going to have to ask a question that's going to require a little bit more familiarity and comfort from the participant, you have to kind of give a little to get a little in that situation, right? So I have to give up some aspect of who I am as the researcher to create that equality in that space. And so I think, I think Tara and other folks who are kind of like wrestling with that question of how do I ethically address this in research, I think really self-disclosure, even like as a practitioner, is there's got to be some intention behind it, right? Like I need that to build the rapport so that my participant doesn't feel like I'm putting them under a microscope when I ask them to answer such a personal question about themselves. And so those are things that I think about just kind of from a research perspective. I also just, I would 100% endorse the processing time and the ability to take breaks. Tony, I mentioned in the chat, Tony and I take breaks in the middle of all of our research interviews with participants. And I've actually found that to be incredibly refreshing because we're qualitative researchers and sometimes people just need a moment to like take a quick break to kind of stop telling their story. So those are things that I think about from a research perspective. I have to say that there's a checklist that me and some other people put together that is in a book that you can get that also talks about this kind of stuff. But you all, I'm sure, can find it. It's on the NTRAC. It's with the NTRAC group, and we presented on it at USARF last time.
Thank you for that. There's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. And one is, are there any care experience specific scholarships? I don't know whether anybody can answer that. And another one is what would have made your research easier or better? If anyone has any suggestions. Katrina?
I won a scholarship with Huddersfield, so I'm in a very fortunate position to have get to speak about this. So I wouldn't say there's specific scholarships, but if your research is deemed that somebody hasn't done before, I think it is just that process. I mean, my proposal won me the scholarship, so I there isn't anything specific for care experience research to my knowledge, but I think it's worth saying I applied to 27 universities before I got this scholarship, so it's been years of knocking on doors. So my journey is completely different, but I have not done anything specifically for care experience research. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina. Anyone got any ideas about what might have made their research easier, less challenging?
So it's kind of hard to say when my research was myself. But access to records, and I think a lot of us have touched on the whole issue regarding access to records, but having support for going through my records, which I've now, through my experiences, have actually implemented in my own local authority, is someone to support you when going through your records specifically. My life story work was completely different, and I had somebody with me every step of the way. She was sharing her understanding of my story, and then I got to reflect on that. That was the process there. But when it came to my case notes and my reports and things like that, my experience of that was very similar to most other people's, in that it was horrific. It was awful. And it really halted my research for a little bit until I got this sort of massive rant out of my system. And then I could look at it objectively again. But that emotive response to accessing a file, it really does influence a lot more than you think it would. Is that, yeah, have I worded that okay?
Yeah, thank you. You have, yeah, thank you. Rosie, I can identify with being younger. Ditto. Anything else anyone would like to say or ask?
Yeah, I'll just chip in briefly on the what would have helped with the PhD. I should say that my PhD, which was a long time ago now, was nothing to do with the care experience. So there were no issues like raised by it in that respect. But very simply, money. It's as basic as that. Everything else for me was quite easy, but without a bank of mum and dad, it was just poverty for a decade, more or less. So I think it's important to recognise that actually there are lots of personal issues raised if you're a care experience going through education at any level. But sometimes the things that really help are just really, really basic things, and finance is the most basic.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Bernadette, oh, that's a clap. Okay. Yeah. So, has anybody got anything they'd like to round up with? I mean, how have people felt about today? What are people's sort of general responses been? Yeah, Josie.
I mean, it's partly what would have helped and a reflection on today, and it is this group. As I said in my presentation, they're listening to everybody else talking about their struggles or their issues or their journey or their and practical things like money is fantastic. It's I know there are other areas of my life when I was, for example, when I was searching for my first family, there was an organisation called NORCAP, which was an organisation for the counselling and something or another of adoptees. And we used to meet in a room which was rented to us by the an adoption society, actually, which was a bit odd. So all these children's furniture and stuff. But it was so radical because we were all searching and we were all figuring out ways to do stuff. So it's the principle of a self-help group, really. So today's been like that for me. It's been just great to hear everybody, and I know that would have been, but it's very specific. It's creative writing PhD, writing about oneself. It's so cool to hear, Day, you're working with your university to put those structures in place. And Katrina, these are fantastic things to my ears. So it is support, it is knowing each other and being able to talk to each other in email. That's what I think.
If I could just add to that, and that the community itself has just been so supportive. I know we've all been communicating via WhatsApp, via email, and we've all been supporting each other in any which way we can. And I love being a part of this community and the support that you've all given me. I mean, at one point you saved my life at one point, so thank you so much.
I think it's probably a good time to finish there. I think we've heard some extraordinary things. We've shared an awful lot, and I hope everybody who's sort of taken part will take something away from today. I know I certainly will. My head's, you can't see it, but it's exploding under here with everything that I've heard and thought and everything. So thank you, Annie, for bringing this together and making this happen, because I think it's been very productive, supportive and innovative. So thank you.